the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I can't say that without thinking of the tune, the movie, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Wah, wah, wah. I didn't want to pay for the licensing for that music, so I have to kind of do it out loud for you guys. So I apologize for my singing. But yeah, so if you've been in the working world for a while, or been exposed to a lot of different organizations, you've probably seen a lot of different cultures. And there are a bunch of them. And there's some that are really strong and good and fun to be around and fun to work in. There's some that are they're just tough. They're just tough cultures. And for a lot of different reasons, and we'll get into those. And then there's some that are just so much infighting and so much ugliness. And so we'll talk about those. Over the last 30 years, I've had experience assessing and helping to change, as well as living in a number of organizational cultures over these years. And really, over the last 20 years of this, I've been focusing specifically on the culture that impacts safety results, or safety culture, however you want to put that. And over this time, we've noticed some really common profiles that show up consistently over time. And so we thought it might be helpful to kind of talk through some of these different profiles that we've seen frequently. And but first, a couple of caveats. Number one, these are not set in stone. Culture is an ever-changing type of phenomenon and can be affected by a number of significant events. Um, and then secondly, these often overlap. So these cultures are not, there aren't hard barriers between these different profiles that we're going to share with you. You'll often see, a culture within an organization is not homogenous, that you'll see in one site, one type of culture, and a completely different site or plant, a different type of culture. And then corporate even a third type of culture. So it doesn't, they can vary a lot across an organization, and even within a particular site, you may see different variations of that. And then the third comment I want to make, or caveat, is that you'll hear people talk about safety climate, or climate and culture. Climate and culture are siblings, but they're not identical twins. In fact, you can have a short event, or a specific event that dramatically impacts the climate. Like, for example, if you have a site that has a fatality or a serious injury, that tends to really impact the safety climate almost immediately in that group. But it doesn't impact the culture unless those changes are reinforced over time. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. And if nothing else changes, that climate will then kind of drift back to the old culture that they used to have. So again, they're related, but they're not the same thing. Okay, so with those caveats in mind, let's jump right into the first profile. So the first one we call dangerously strong, and that's where you've got an organization in which the leadership is pretty strong, but there isn't as much attention or focus or emphasis or systems around safety. And so what kinds of organizations show up like it? Well, there's sometimes you'll see some tech startups where they're moving fast and breaking things, and they're really adaptable and innovative and growing very quickly. And sometimes if it's one of those things where they move into manufacturing, where they're now starting to build things and they keep growing fast and they're building these manufacturing plants and doing all of those sorts of things, they can quickly grow into a situation where they need more safety, or no more of a mature safety approach, but they haven't gotten there yet, because they still have that move fast and break things sort of environment. But when it comes to operations or manufacturing, where you want quality and precision and operational discipline as well as safety, moving fast and breaking things doesn't really work so great. So you'll see that sometimes in those sorts of organizations in which they start off one way, but then they grow and mature into another type of organization, and the culture sort of lags behind it. Now, the one thing that's where startups may be different is that the strength of the leadership can vary significantly, usually by how strong are the founders in leadership pieces. But there's another organization. This will be the only one that I'll mention because the other, as we go into the other profiles, I've got companies in mind, but I can't really talk about them. But the one area that comes to mind most readily that has really strong leadership but didn't have as much of a focus on safety was or is the United States Marine Corps. Now, I'm a former Marine, but about 15 years ago, I had a project where I was working closely with the Marine Corps, and we were doing cultural assessments of various units within the Marines. And that was one of the things that came out consistently in these assessment profiles is that the leadership scores, the leadership scales were off the charts. The Marines were credible. The Marine leadership was credible. They followed through on the things they said they do. And it made sense because they select on that. They have a lot of training, and it's huge part of who the Marines are is an emphasis on being excellent leaders. But they didn't have as much of a focus on safety. So the scales around the safety element, the value for safety, were much lower. And the reason we were even brought in was because they were starting when Marines would come back from a deployment and they would be on base, usually in the United States or in Okinawa. What they found is that there was a whole lot of reckless behavior, not just on base, but off base. And so it was getting Marines seriously injured and even killed. And so they wanted to improve their approach to safety in that area. But when we showed the leadership these different profiles, what their worry that they expressed is that if we attend too much to safety, it would affect the warrior ethic. And they would even say things like, we want Marines that are going to go toward the fight, not away from it. And we worry that if we emphasize safety too much, it's going to impact that ethic, that approach that the Marines have. And so it took a while before we were before the leaders kind of got it. And really how we had to do is we had to reframe what safety meant in terms of language that they can understand. So it wasn't safety the way you and I would think about it. Safety is essentially battlefield tactics. So the Marines don't do Pickett's charge anymore. They don't line up and just walk forward. They do, the way they try to accomplish their mission is in a way that keeps the Marines as safe as possible while still accomplishing the mission. And that's really what we're trying to do in safety. We're still trying to get the job done, but do it in a way that protects the Marines as much as possible. So that's kind of how we had to reframe it. Now, the one thing with this profile is that if you're in an organization that is like this, it's actually one of the ones that's easiest to change because you've got such a strong leadership foundation. And once the leadership gets it around how safety can improve or can help them improve productivity and quality, then that leadership attention towards safety and then building the systems behind that is almost all it takes because people already trust the leadership. There's a whole lot of credibility, and once they change the focus, people will follow them and go on board. So that's the first one. You don't see it a ton, but there are certain areas where you will see that dangerously strong type of profile. Second one is the cog in the machine. This is one in which production is absolutely king, and safety, if it's on the list of priorities at all, is secondary or sometimes even lower. Now, often in safety, we'll talk about moving from a culture of compliance to one of commitment. Well, you're in compliance, or you may even be in pre-compliance, where people aren't even complying with the rules because that's not what's valued in the organization. What's valued is production, getting the job done, making it happen, achieving the business objectives that are set out there. And that is the main point of emphasis. That's what's tracked, and that's what you hear about. And it reminds me of one, this is about 20 years ago, there was a railroad that had the reputation that if you got injured, you got fired. And so what was the mentality there? Well, it was basically you're on your own, and if you did get injured, you basically limped off the property if you were going to get fired. You're not gonna say, "Hey, I got injured," because you don't want the consequences that come from that. And so you often see this as well when the business is fragile, so barely hanging on, where it becomes kind of a run to failure sort of approach to maintenance and production, where you're just patching up valves and equipment and tools, and you're just getting them so that you can keep running, because the business, the survival is dependent on it. And so that takes precedent, and everything else is secondary. So what does that look like from a safety standpoint? Well, excuse me. If they talk about a safety at all, it's at a lower. It's really in just sort of compliance at the minimum or at the maximum, and only so that they can avoid any other negative consequences from regulatory bodies. But essentially, safety comes down to the individual being careful. And in fact, I've had leaders say that, where they're like, "Hey, we've given them all the SOPs and we've given them all the PPE. It's basically on them, meaning the frontline workers, to work safely." And so that ownership piece is pushed down a bit. It's certainly not going to be reinforced by systems or by measures or by leadership. Now, what you can see from time to time in these sorts of organizations is you can see some really interesting pockets, because ownership is on the individual or on the team. Sometimes you'll run into some of those teams that are really mature from a safety standpoint, and in that they're definitely brothers keepers, where they are looking out for each other, they're taking care of each other, and they're really okay, because they realize that we're all we've got in terms of doing the job and getting the job done without anybody getting hurt. But those are in pockets. And that's really what it looks like when you're in a cog in the machine. You're just one part, you're just a piece of machinery in this. It's not a fun environment to be in. And particularly if you're patching things up. Okay, third one, and we've got 5 of these profiles we're going to talk through. In some ways, this is kind of the opposite of that startup one. This is nice and soft. So this is where it's a very nice, very respectful type of organization. Often you'll see this with really large, well-established companies that have had a lot of success over the years. And sometimes what happens is that if they're in industries in which you have a whole lot of highly paid, skilled workers, engineers, and they've got options to go other places, this is how this kind of environment can be built. And what happens is that it's they're making money, they're making profit. It becomes a lot more kind of conservative from a standpoint of, we don't want to make any mistakes. And there's a highly collaborative sort of environment. But that means you've got to get anything done. It has to go through all sorts of stakeholders to get any sort of decision happening. It moves slow, so it's not really like that startup moving fast and breaking things. They don't want to break anything. They just they don't want to make any mistakes. And so it's a nice culture. There's highly respectful, very professional. People are look out for each other. A lot of consensus building. You need input from all sorts of stakeholders. sometimes can be heavily bureaucratic, and sometimes you'll see this in government agencies, but you'll see it also in some really big, uh, organizations as well. And and then but one of the challenges they have is that because it's very respectful and very nice, you get challenges with accountability, where it's challenging sometimes for a leader to even, and I've seen this where you've got a very senior leader in their leadership team, and they want the leaders to do something, and they tell them, we're going to do this. And yet those other leaders go off and do their own thing, and they give lip service, and there's no accountability, and that flows down, and that causes real issues over time. So the interesting is that's the soft part of that, where it's nice. It's a nice culture to be in. Everybody's nice to each other, just very friendly, but it's soft in that there's little accountability, and sometimes that affects performance. Um, so in this case, in this sort of organizations, if it's a dangerous environment, usually the expectations for safety are very clear because it's part of their values. This is, for example, like an oil and gas type of company, and they may have a lot of good safety systems and tools. And so you've got those expectations, got some good safety tools, but the challenge is that because the leadership is a little bit lacking there, so it's not as good around the follow up and the follow through, and there isn't as much around feedback and accountability. So that's where you see some gaps open up in their safety culture, and create some inconsistency, particularly when you talk about how they manage contractors, which can be a different, have a whole different sort of set of exposures. So that's that kind of nice and soft kind of culture. It's good to be in, but are you really moving the needle? Sometimes you're not, and sometimes there are unforeseen safety gaps emerging. Okay, eroding. So the last one we're going to talk about is best in class, but eroding is one of those situations in which you have a company that was at that really top end where they had excellent leadership and they had a tremendous value for safety. It was above the priority level. It was a value for safety, and everything else was secondary. And then what happens is that um, you've got to change. So there's a change in leadership. When you're best in class, it's got to come from the top. And so maybe you have that CEO or that COO and that senior leadership, and they're all bought in, and safety is a value, and they've created that culture, that environment. But then there's a transition. Maybe the CEO retires, maybe they move to a different one. And if they don't have a good system for continuing that same culture, and they bring in somebody else, maybe it's even somebody from outside comes in, and they don't have the same values, it can have an impact on the safety culture, but it's slow and happening. So what happens is that, say a new leader comes in, they give all the same lip service to safety. They're very smooth. They talk all the same talk, but when it comes to their attention, what they pay attention to, what they provide resources for, what they care about, what they ask about, it moves maybe a little bit more toward production or to a reorganization or to acquisitions or some other thing outside of that. And then what happens, and it changes what's expected of you as a leader. So if you really want to move up as a leader, now it means, okay, I gotta change the way I do things, and the things I care about also shift. And usually with that, what you'll see if you do a cultural profile of that, after a few years, you'll see that the perceptions of leadership have gone down a little bit, but still the safety culture, the value for safety often stays up high. And so you see that gap between where they view leadership and where they view the safety values. Now, that's just a point in time snapshot. And so but if you watch it over time, what you'll see is that value for safety will start to come down. It's essentially eroding because that foundation of leadership has started to crumble. And when that crumbles, this great house that you've built on the side, it's all of a sudden the ground is coming out from underneath it. And so it's sad to see. And there have been a few organizations that worked with over the years where they're kind of already on that downslope, and it's very frustrating for people, particularly if they grew up in the previous environment and knew what it used to be like, and they felt a loss there. All right, last profile, best in class. Best in class for now. This is where safety is a definitive value, not a priority. And so we put those. So you have safety as a priority versus safety as a value. You want it as a value because values are kind of immutable and they're how you operate. Priorities are fine, but there are also multiple priorities. And sometimes the top priority can shift depending on the situation, the industry, economics, et cetera. And so in best in class, safety is elevated to a value. This is who we are, and this is how we operate. And that's just how we're going to do things. And to get there, you've got to have, like we've been talking about, leadership has to be really strong and foundational, and they have to get it. This have to be a driving motivation for them. And then I also need to help build the excellent systems that ensure that the leadership stays strong. And so what does that mean? That means that the way you develop talent, the way you select and promote leaders, the way you develop them across the businesses and through rotations, et cetera, those are all set in place to reinforce the leadership you have in place now. So it's not just something that, hey, we got lucky, we got a good CEO, or we got good senior leadership that values safety, and once they're gone, it's gone. It's one of those where that is woven into all the systems that develop the leaders coming up behind them. Also with that, when they you got to have that first, and then from there they start to build that mature safety, with excellent systems that ingrain and reinforce that value for safety, and as well as how they promote and manage performance, keeps that value for safety in mind as part of that. And so these are fun organizations to be in, not just because of they're good ones to be on, and you typically are a winning organization, you're doing well in the other metrics as well. But then you're also one of those where that this is you can feel comfortable. This is a value that means something to folks. But these organizations would be the first to tell you that they haven't won anything. It's not like this where this image where you've got you get an award for safety and then you're good. It's not like eating right or exercising. We're like, hey, I did a push-up today, so boy, I don't have to do that anymore. Thank God. So it's something you constantly have to pay attention to, constantly have to reinforce. The best metaphor I've ever heard about culture is that it's a little bit more like tending to a garden, where you constantly have to kind of attend to the nutrients that are provided, the sunlight, the water, and as well as weeding out the things that are detracting from the garden from time to time. And that's kind of how you have to think about culture. And in these organizations, they still have injuries, sometimes serious ones. But they've got a transparent and learning culture that looks at these incidents from a systemic point of view, not a let's figure out who to blame and who to fire, but from a system level. And then they continue to push and invest in controls that push it to the higher end of the hierarchy of controls. Because they feel like they're solving problems as they go along. So that's the best in class. And they would even recognize we're best in class, but maybe it's just for now. And they still want to get better. Okay, so we've kind of gone through these five different profiles, and recognizing that yours may not fit in any one of those specifically, but let's do a quick poll. Which which profile does your organization, or maybe it's just, a part of your organization, most aligns with you, or if it's other.
And just a note, we will not know who voted for which category, so don't worry. You can be honest with us. We'll just get a total count. And if for some reason you believe your culture hits another category that Mike hasn't discussed, go ahead and click the other button, but put a note in chat and let us know what other culture you have, or why you chose other.
Yeah. Yeah, we certainly didn't cover all of the options available.
All right, it looks like Nice and Soft is an emerging leader, followed quickly by Best in Class, and then a couple cogs in the machine.
Mm.
But for the most part, Nice and Soft and Best in Class are kind of running neck and neck here.
Okay, good. Oh, it's good to hear that there's some folks that are in that Best in Class piece.
And I've got a couple.
Yeah, hybrid between Best in Class and wait, what was that? Between cog in the machine and Nice and Soft. Oh, interesting. So I assume, I'm not going to put you on the spot, Aaron, but I assume that's partly depending on the different site or the different region or location. Is that correct? Because cultures can vary a lot across a particular company.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. That's why we emphasize leadership so much, because they play a driving role in that piece of it. And we've seen that.
All right, it looks like we're going to close out at 48% for Nice and Soft,
Okay.
33% for Best in Class, and 19% with cog in the machine.
Any other comments from folks in the for the chat about what it feels like to be a cog in the machine, and or even for the Nice and Soft? Do you find, like we are talking about, like where it's a fun, great group to be around, but the accountability may not be there, and so you feel like you're not maybe as successful as you could be? Or if you're in one of the Best in Class, like what do you think are the driving points? Takes way too long to make things happen in a Nice and Soft environment. You're absolutely right, Toby. That's where sometimes there's the decision-making clarity is not there. And so you got to have everyone has to be on board. Otherwise something can't get moved forward. And sometimes that's the downside of a high consensus building kind of approach. Yeah. Too many people want to be involved in time sensitive decisions, so you lose out on opportunities. Barbara, it feels like cog in the machine at the shop floor may feel Best in Class the further up the chain. Oh, very great point, Barbara. That the if you were talking to senior leadership, they may think how this is how we are, but when you talk to the floor, it's a different perspective, and there's a gap, and we see that a lot. And so much of that is the leaders say, like, I'm talking about safety all the time, I'm always asking about it, and their intentions are that way, but their actions, what they pay attention to, what they reward, it translates, or it's communicated differently on the shop floor. So excellent point, Barbara. Oh, Janine, a great comment. The Nice and Soft can sneak into eroding, and then wow, here we are. Yeah, and that's the company I was thinking of when I was there. At one point, had been Best in Class, and they were always Nice and Soft, but the soft part started to erode, and I worried that they're actually moving more toward a cog in the machine sort of environment. Oh, great, Jason. That's good to be in that kind of world where you're fixing the systems. Hard part is that it's just natural human nature to say, okay, um, an incident happens, you go to the last thing that happened. And so you got to fight that human nature all the time. Tim Makuda, nice and soft are not the same thing, right? Kind means honest, but in a respectful way. Nice means totally honest, not totally honest to spare feeling. Using nice and kind in the same category is confusing. That's a good point, Tim. I probably shouldn't have had kind in the description of that. That's an excellent point. Yeah, because you're right. Because sometimes it's they say it's a psychologically safe environment, but when you're being honest as a kindness, giving feedback, it's not viewed. They don't take it well, and so yeah, that's a very good point, Tim. Okay, great discussion. Thanks for all the comments. Very helpful. Okay, so we've talked about some of the profiles. Now, how do you know where you are? How do you know where your culture is? Well, it's hard to talk about organizational culture without also talking about the godfather of organizational culture, which is the late great Edgar Schein. And if you want to geek out on organizational culture, check out his seminal work, Organizational Culture and Leadership. Mine's all dog-eared and bookmarked. It's great. And in it, he talks about 3 different levels of culture. One level, this top end here, are the artifacts. These are the things that are visible in the culture and send a signal immediately as to, what's it like here. And so the main kind of compare and contrast I can think of is way back a long, long time ago. I'm going to show how old I am. I was doing some work for Texaco and going to what were their headquarters in White Plains, New York. And the headquarters building was like a regular building, and a lot of cubes and offices and things like that. But then if you went to the 4th floor and you went to the executive wing, you opened up this door and it was a completely different world. The walls were mahogany, the carpet was plusher, and the offices had mahogany on them, and it was very whisper quiet, and it definitely told you, okay, you're in a totally different world than just the floor below. So that was Texaco, and it definitely reinforced these visible artifacts, reinforced this definitively hierarchical approach. Versus I was in a startup in San Francisco a few years back, and very different. T-shirts, jeans, all in the same sorts of offices and cubicles, whether you're the founder and owner, or whether you just were hired as an intern, yesterday. You couldn't tell the difference because they're all about the same age, and you couldn't tell roles by dress or offices or anything like that. So very non-hierarchical kind of culture, or at least visible artifacts. So that's really what we mean by artifacts, is that what stands out that sends a signal. The second part are the beliefs. And so one way is, if you ask people like, all right, what's it take to get ahead here? What's most valued here? Who gets promoted? You'll get a sense of what their sort of the espoused beliefs and values. And we don't mean that in terms of what values are listed on the wall, because we all know like those could, hey, if your organization aligns with those, great. But a lot of times those are on the wall, but then the way people actually behave and what gets rewarded is a different animal. So we're talking about the things that are really get rewarded, or who gets promoted, those sorts of things. And those are the espoused values and beliefs. The last one are the deepest are the underlying assumptions, which are often unconscious and unquestioned views on how things are to be done. This is just how we do things, particularly for people that have been there for 20 years. This is just how we do things. And they don't even question it, or even are kind of aware of some of these underlying assumptions. And so from Schein's point of view, the only way to really understand organizational culture is that you got to go sit in the offices and watch how people work and essentially be an anthropologist for weeks or months on end. Well, I mean, that's great. And Edgar Schein is a giant and he's smart and he's an academic, but it's not very practical, honestly. It's not going to happen much. But the alternative to that is that you identify what are the elements of the culture you want. So, for example, for safety culture, which is what we get asked a lot about, is we've been able to do the research around where these are the elements that we know when organizations have these elements in place, they are moving toward a best-in-class safety culture. So things like the leadership is credible and fair and engaging, and they value safety. There's a reporting environment in which it's safe to report issues or ideas. And when you report incidents, you're not, you don't get disciplined, those sorts of things. And then there's also like a highly collaborative, people go above and beyond, they're engaged, they intervene with each other if they see issues. All of those elements have been, in the research have shown, okay, if you've got these pieces of a safety culture, then you're more likely to have better safety results. And so once you define those elements or find there, then what you can do is, and then use a much more economical process, efficient process where you survey people on those things, you talk to folks, and then you go observe the work environment, usually in a short amount of time. And then from there, you can get a pretty good sense of where people are on all of these different elements. And so you're really just evaluating how close are they to that kind of best in class safety culture and environment. And so that's the best way to kind of know, where are you on these sorts of things. Now, the next question we get is like, all right, how do we change a culture? How do we get from where we are now, if we're like, I'm a leader, this organization is a cog in the machine, how do I get them to be best in class? Well, there are three steps, but easy is not, it's not easy. They're not that easy, but they can be. The first step is to get clear. Often when people engage in a culture change, they use kind of very vague, almost like vision statements. Say, oh, we want to be innovative, or we want to be a flexible, adaptable organization. Those sorts of things. Great, that's great. What does that look like? What are the specific behaviors I need to engage in that would demonstrate to you that I'm changing, or that our organization is changing? If you can't articulate that, then don't talk about a culture change yet, because you're not ready. It's not cooked yet. Also, the other piece too is that rarely is a culture need to do a complete 180. Go from here to going there. There are often positive elements around the culture that you want to keep. And so it's really important that so much of this work has got to be done at that senior leadership level to figure out, all right, what do we want to keep? What are the behaviors we want to specifically say, keep doing, because this is a valuable part of how we act in our organization? And then what are the different things specifically we want people to do differently or do more of, and get clear about that. And so that's the first step that people have to be, is clear around what those two things are. What are we keeping and what do we want to change? And also you need to recognize that if the things you want to change are part of those underlying assumptions, recognize it's going to cause anxiety. And that's what and that's some of that, a lot of that resistance is going to come from that piece of it. And that leads us to the second step. So once you're clear, you got to pave the road. You've got to remove the obstacles for doing the new behaviors that you want people to engage in. You've got to provide the resources, whether that's training or tools or things that'll help them get clear on what it is you want them to do and to do differently. And and make sure that it's okay. They're forgiven if they start and it's not going to feel good. People are trying new things. They're going to make mistakes. It's not going to feel comfortable. It's not going to feel great. And so you need to like look for those opportunities where people are doing that and then reinforce it. And as a leader, you need to model the way. You can't just sort of throw this over the fence and hope it happens, because it's not going to. The other piece around this is that, once you sort of articulate the kinds of behaviors you want to see, you're going to see like a bell curve. You're going to see the early adopters and people that are really going out there and doing it. And you're going to see some laggards. Ignore the laggards. Your focus is on the big hump in the middle and moving that in the direction. And the way to do that is jump on the stories from those early adopters. People are just starting it, and what was the impact? What was the result? What did it look like? What did they try? What worked and what didn't? And then you got to get that out and communicate all over the place, because people are going to be looking to see, I guess I could do this, but is anybody else doing this, or am I going to be the only one out there? And so you want to give the impression that this is a groundswell of change that's happening, and that there are people doing this and they're seeing success, and that's going to be, you want to get on the boat. And that's how you slowly move that group toward that big group in the middle toward a tipping point. And once you can get to that tipping point, then you're definitely on your path to actually changing the culture. And then, for the laggards at the bottom, they're smart. They're gonna see how the wind's going, and they're gonna say, oh my gosh, this does have staying power, and they're gonna get on board. Or they're gonna stay like that, and then it'll be easy to figure out who's continuing the laggard piece, where they are. And then the last piece is that once you kind of get that tipping point and get that momentum, you've got to persist, persist, persist. This is, leaders will often like kind of, okay, we're good. Everybody knows we've moved forward and let's get out of here. But, as soon as you feel like, okay, we've changed the culture and we're good, take a pause, take a step, because you have to communicate even more and longer than you think necessary. And because, it takes a while. This is you've just put something in cement, and now you need to let that cement cure, and that takes time and that takes persistence. And there's going to be slippage. That's think about like any sort of new habit you've tried to. I've exercised every day for the last 2 weeks, and then today I'm just going to eat a pint of ice cream on the couch. That slippage happens, and it's okay, and it's forgivable, and it's natural. So be aware of that, and then kind of get back on the boat, and get back on the train, or whatever metaphor you want to use. So the other piece for leaders, the caution is that avoid jumping to a whole new initiative or a whole new program. They've got to keep persisting with this until it is the way we do things around here. And only then does it make sense to kind of jump to. So often people kind of just go to other things, and then you start to see even more slippage. So those are the kind of the 3 easy steps to doing a culture change. Just a couple closing thoughts, and then we'll open it up for questions. As any of my, I love this banner because as any of my home projects can attest, I've had many experiences with something that I was going to do, or we did, and we thought it'd be easy, but then it turned out to be way more complex and problematic. And this is how I think a lot of leaders, think about organizational change. They did it not because it was easy, but because they thought it was going to be easy. And there's an old saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And there's been so many brilliant initiatives that have been swallowed up by the culture, usually because it didn't do those 3 steps that we talked about. So if you want to know where you are, we can help you with this. Or if you want to just help move the needle forward, we can help you with that too.
We had a question that I'll shorten a little bit here that says something to the effect of, what do you do with a manager who's been trained, sensitized, and coached, but despite all of the effort, does not live the value of worker care and is reluctant to handle OSH issues properly?
Interesting. And there's a couple of things. First of all, I'd want to talk about like what's happening here. The value of the organization or what the organization is expecting is A, and yet you're doing B. Do they even recognize that there's a difference? So that's one element of it. And if it's something like that, well, yeah, I recognize the difference. And yes, I can do that. But I don't care or whatever. Then that's where, the boss needs to be involved. Because, most of us will do things that are in our own self-interest, let's just say. So we want to, if I'm in a leadership position and my boss is measuring me on this thing or wants me to do better on this thing, and what they are attending to is going to be what I'm focused on, because I want to do well, I want to get a good rating at the end, and I want to get a bonus and all of those sorts of things. So if the leadership is aligned with all of that, then that's how you're going to help move that person. But there are some people that are like they dig their heels in and they're like they're not going to change, and that's where that leadership has to step up, and they need to understand that if they don't act on that kind of stuff, it affects their individual credibility, not just the leader that's obstinate. It affects that boss's credibility and how people view that boss.
Right. Just had one come into chat that says, tell us about the importance of trust in culture change efforts. How essential is it to build trust, and with whom?
Oh, it's absolutely critical. And it's important that you have one of the scales that we'll look at often is what we call management credibility. Do managers' actions align with their words? And it's difficult for an organization to undergo a culture change or really any kind of change without a foundation of management credibility. If that's not there, you're going to have because if the managers are trustworthy and they say, hey, for the health of our business, we've got to move in this direction, then you're like, okay, I trust you. You've shown that you're reliable. You've shown that, that you make good decisions. And so I'll give it a shot. But if I don't believe you to be, if I don't believe anything you say, I'm gonna be a little bit more of a laggard. I'm gonna wait and see, and let's just see if this has staying legs, and yeah. So trust is absolutely critical, particularly in the leadership, because they're the ones that have to go first.
Thanks, Michael, for the question. We had another one that was submitted, and I think you talked about this a little bit, Mike, but maybe you can put a fine point on it. How do you start a conversation with the leadership team when they're completely naive about developing culture?
How do I start a conversation? Well, the first thing I would say is, do you know where your culture is now, and B, do you want to change it? Do you want to get better? So if they don't have a clear idea where they are now, and or they don't have any designs to change it, then okay, where are we? But if they say like, okay, we think we've got a good culture, but we're not sure. Okay, well, let's go find out. Or they may be like, we're in a position where we feel like we had a good culture and it's eroding, and we're seeing the cracks in the foundation. What do we do? Okay, now we have a conversation. what are the specific things you want to do, or that would shore up these cracks. And because culture is not just about behavior. Behavior is critical because that's how you get it, but it's also about how you measure it and how you put the systems in place that support that. So it's a whole ecosystem that has to be built around this culture change if you really want to make any headway.
I find that most leaders don't really have a definition of what safety culture is.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like some people gonna get into really academic debates about is safety and is there a safety culture or is it just culture? Um, I find the culture of the organization and the safety culture are very much entwined. Um, and in fact, a lot of the things we'll measure in a survey are elements of leadership and the culture that don't only even have the word safety in them. However, they're strongly correlated with safety results. And so there's a lot of entwinement there. The most common definition you'll hear of culture is the way things are done around here. And if you want to apply that to the subsection of safety culture, that's similar. Like here's the way we keep people safe in this world, in our world here, and then that's a starting point for defining what your safety culture is. Yeah, there are a few things that we know are, and we've seen this in the research, that are elements of an organizational culture that are correlated with safety results. And I talked about a few of these, and we can kind of talk through like the specific things we look for and measure. But from a leadership standpoint, are the leaders credible? Are they fair? Procedural justice is one of the elements we measure, and that has I did a webinar on that, and that is a critical component of a strong organizational culture and also strong safety results. So is leadership credible? Are they fair? Do they value safety? Also, what kind of reporting culture is there? Like, can I say, Pam's my boss, can I say, hey, Pam, I think this is a bad idea and we should do this instead? And then what happens to me if I say that? And then how likely am I to like report an incident if it happens? And what happens to me if I do? And, all those sorts of, so there's a long list of things that we've seen, either in the research or also in our experience, that we know leads to our good characteristics of organizational culture that predicts safety results. So,
tips on how to move management past TRIR metrics to culture change through training, communication, safe behaviors, and accountability practices.
Move past TRI, yeah, is gosh, we've got our own clients that are like great clients. They've really moved the needle. They're strong, and yet they still are about TRIR. And we sort of try to move them, if they're going to stay with the lagging metrics, we try to move them at least to let's add SIF potential in there too, so you have a sense of your SIF exposure, serious injury and fatality exposure as well. The hardest part is that people struggle with the leading indicators because they're not sure if they're truly leading. They're not sure how to impact them or change them. And they're not sure if those leading indicators, even if they're leading, are truly correlated with the lagging indicators. So when you can, and we've helped folks kind of construct their own little database of leading indicators. But it's a tough one for sure. As Jason said, yeah, it's a long game for sure. I mean, that's one of the things that's frustrating, but also helpful about safety, is that you have a comparison across a bunch of different companies that's TRIR. But it is frustrating. It's hard to move them.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.